Once upon a time in the heart of Renaissance Europe, there lived a man whose wealth and influence were so vast that kings and emperors whispered his name with a mixture of awe and fear. He was born into a family of weavers in Augsburg, a bustling trading city in the Holy Roman Empire, yet he rose to command a fortune that would make modern tycoons look like shopkeepers. His name was Jakob Fugger, and his life is a tale of humble beginnings, audacious bets, royal intrigues, and unintended consequences that would reshape the religious and political map of Europe forever. To understand how a peasant's grandson became the banker of kings and the architect of a new economic order, we must journey back to the 15th century and follow the threads that wove his destiny. The story begins with Hans Fugger, a simple man who fled rural oppression to seek opportunity in the free city of Augsburg, where guilds offered a path to wealth for those willing to work. Hans was a weaver, a spinner of cloth rather than tales, but he married well and worked tirelessly, slowly building a small fortune through the honest business of textiles and the more dubious trade of making contacts. When Hans died, he left his widow Elizabeth and their children a modest but growing business. It was Elizabeth, a shrewd and determined woman, who kept the looms humming and the accounts balanced in a male world. Her son, Jakob Fugger the elder, learned from her example. He expanded the workshop, joined the Merchants' Guild, and diversified into spices, wool and exotic goods from the East, laying the foundation for an economic empire. Jakob the Elder married Barbara Basinger, the daughter of a wealthy merchant, thus forging alliances that brought respectability and connections. Together they had 11 children, each destined to play a role in the Fugger saga. The youngest of these siblings was Jakob the Younger, our protagonist, who was born in 1459. His parents envisioned a career in the church for him, thinking a cleric in the family would ensure salvation. But destiny had other plans. His brothers saw his gift with numbers and persuaded him to study commerce instead. The bright teenager was sent to Venice, the beating heart of Mediterranean trade, to learn modern accounting. In Venice he encountered double-entry bookkeeping, the revolutionary system that transformed chaos into clarity, and he studied with Italian bankers who traded not in goods but in credit, shaping his understanding of money's alchemy. The young apprentice returned home with ledgers full of knowledge and ambitions that reached beyond the marketplace. His brothers trusted him with a small agency in Innsbruck, where he would test his theories against reality. Innsbruck was the gateway to Tyrol, a mountainous region rich in silver. Its ruler, Archduke Sigismund of Austria, was a flamboyant noble who loved lavish banquets, tournaments, and hunting parties more than balancing his books. Sigismund's court was famed for extravagance. Dwarves wrestled giants for his amusement, musicians played through the night, and servants carried plates of roasted boar across halls hung with tapestries, all paid for with borrowed coin. Other bankers shuddered at the thought of lending to such a spendthrift. They knew his debts were already staggering. Jakob saw an opportunity. He believed that risk and reward are two sides of the same coin. In a bold move, he offered Sigismund a small loan and, more importantly, treated the Archduke with respect. He did not beg for favours, he delivered funds promptly and refused to be intimidated by noble heirs. This combination of capital and confidence won the Archduke's trust. When Sigismund needed money in the midst of a skirmish with Venice, Jakob gambled his family's entire fortune on one audacious transaction. He lent Sigismund 100,000 florins, not to be repaid in coin but in something far more valuable, the right to purchase silver from the Tyrolean mines at a fixed price and control over the treasury. At that moment, the Fugger family business ceased to be merely a merchant house and became a financial powerhouse. With direct access to the Schwaz mine, Jakob controlled the largest source of silver in Europe. Wagons laden with glittering ore rolled from the mountain tunnels to his warehouses. The metal flowed into coins that jingled across kingdoms, and Jakob learned that wealth is not just created, but managed like a river. He reinvested his profits in the copper mines of Hungary, in partnership with Jan Thurzo, a mining entrepreneur. Together they established one of the earliest joint stock companies, pooling capital and expertise to dominate the market. Copper was the lifeblood of warfare, the material of cannon, bells and utensils. By controlling its supply, Jakob could set prices and determine the terms on which kings armed their armies and merchants outfitted their ships. This strategy paid off handsomely. The company invested more than 1 million Hungarian florins and earned twice as much in profits, an unheard-of return in an era when most merchants were content with modest margins. As his fortune swelled, Jakob began to see money as a tool for shaping politics. When his rival creditor, the Prince Bishop of Brixen, died, the Pope claimed the inheritance, threatening to seize assets pledged to Fugger. Jakob travelled to Rome, argued his case before cardinals, and secured his rights. The experience taught him a harsh lesson. Power could not be assumed. It had to be negotiated and sometimes purchased with gold. From then on, he viewed monarchs and prelates not as untouchable lords, but as players in a grand game. He resolved to sit at the table with them, not as a petitioner, but as a partner. His next target was Archduke Maximilian, Sigismund's cousin, an ambitious Habsburg who dreamed of uniting Germany and Italy under his banner. Maximilian lacked the funds to wage wars and bribe electors, but he had authority. Jakob financed Maximilian's campaigns, providing money for soldiers, cannon, and even for the lavish weddings and tournaments that cemented alliances. In return, Maximilian granted him titles, lands, and more importantly, access to new mining territories. In 1494, the Fugger firm became a public company, allowing investors to buy Suomi shares. 2 years later, it doubled its capital by persuading a bishop to join as a silent partner, blending commerce and clerical power. By the first decade of the 16th century, Jakob was arguably the richest man alive. He was ennobled, allowed to wear a sword and sit among counts. Yet he never forgot that his fortunes depended on political storms. When Maximilian's health waned and the imperial throne became vacant, Jakob faced his greatest test. The electors were bribable, the throne was expensive, and rival dynasties vied for power. He needed to pick a winner. He backed Charles of Burgundy, a young ruler who would become known as Charles V. The cost of securing votes was astronomical, but Jakob advanced about 2/3 of the necessary funds, more than 800,000 florins. The gamble succeeded. Charles ascended to the imperial throne, owing his crown to the banker from Augsburg. In a letter, Jakob reminded the emperor that without him, the election would have gone differently. It was not vanity but leverage. With one emperor indebted to him and another in failing health, Jakob held Europe's strings. Yet he did not rely solely on one patron. He cultivated relationships with England's Henry VIII and other monarchs to hedge his bets. He turned his gaze toward Rome, where the Vatican struggled to finance monumental projects like St. Peter's Basilica. The papacy needed money. Jakob had it. He offered to transfer donations from Germany to Rome, taking a fee for his service. Soon he became known as God's banker. He financed papal armies, hired Swiss mercenaries to guard the Pope, and even leased the mint that coined the very currency the Church used to pay its bills. His tentacles reached every altar. His most controversial arrangement came when Albrecht of Brandenburg sought to buy the Archbishopric of Mainz. Church law forbade simony, but bribes were common. Jakob lent the aspiring cleric 34,000 ducats, securing repayment from the sale of indulgences. The Pope allowed Albrecht to sell forgiveness slips, promising absolution for sins in exchange for money. Half of the proceeds went to Rome to fund basilicas, the rest repaid the Fuggers. It was a business disguised as a spiritual act. News of this arrangement spread through Germany, angering a monk named Martin Luther. He saw the indulgence campaign as proof that the church had sold its soul to greedy merchants, and he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door. Luther's protest sparked the Protestant Reformation, a religious and political earthquake that fractured Christendom, unleashed wars, and forever altered Europe. It was an unintended consequence of a loan, a reminder that money's ripples can become waves. Jakob himself was not particularly devout or irreligious. He viewed the church as another institution to finance. Yet he understood that selling forgiveness to fill coffers could provoke backlash. In private letters, he defended interest as a just price for risk. While his banking empire stirred theological storms, Jakob also invested in philanthropy. In 1516, he founded the Fugger, a walled enclave of tidy houses where poor Catholic workers could live rent-free in exchange for prayers. Residents paid a token rent of 1 florin per year and committed to 3 daily prayers for the Fugger family. The settlement had its own church, gardens, and rules. It remains the world's oldest social housing complex. This charitable project was not an act of guilt, but a reflection of Jakob's belief in structured benevolence. He wanted to create a lasting institution that would outlive him, providing stability for workers who might otherwise fall into destitution. Despite commanding vast riches, Jakob lived simply. He wore plain garments, avoided lavish feasts, and considered idle luxury a threat to his discipline. Envious rivals accused him of making pacts with dark forces and depicting him with horns, counting souls like tiny coins in lurid pamphlets. His defensive interest helped shift the church's stance on usury. For centuries, charging interest had been condemned as sinful, but as economies grew more complex, theologians reconsidered. Jakob's influence accelerated this change, legitimizing lending and fueling capitalism. As years passed, the Fugger empire grew unwieldy. Copper and silver prices fluctuated, wars disrupted trade, rival families, such as the Welses and the Medicis, competed for contracts. Jakob navigated these currents with skill, but also with ever-increasing stress. In his later years, he faced challenges. Hungarian nobles attempted to nationalize mines. Miners went on strike, demanding better pay. The town of Augsburg erupted in artisan protests. The Peasants' War forced him to flee temporarily and hide his wealth. Through it all, his willpower never wavered. He negotiated settlements, bribed officials, and returned home when the danger passed. He placed his company above his personal safety, believing that the preservation of capital justified almost any measure. In 1523, after Charles became emperor, Jakob demanded repayment of outstanding loans. He sent a terse message reminding His Majesty that the imperial crown owed its glitter to Fugger silver. Charles, indebted and besieged, complied. This event became legend. A mere commoner, albeit ennobled, had forced an emperor to honour his obligations. It showed that in the new world of finance, credit could trump birthright, and the man with the ledger could command armies indirectly. Meanwhile, the Reformation was spreading. Princes converted to Protestantism, partly out of conviction, partly to seize church lands and avoid repaying debts. The unity of the empire cracked. Jakob's own network was threatened as Catholic and Lutheran markets divided. He tried to steer a neutral course, offering services to Catholic bishops and Protestant princes alike. But the age of universal medieval Christianity was ending. The alliance of throne and altar that had shielded him was dissolving. In these turbulent years, he focused on consolidating his legacy. He expanded the Fugger, endowed hospitals and sponsored schools. He ensured that his name would live on not only in palaces, but also on humble streets. Jakob Fugger died in 1525 at the age of 66. He left an estate worth more than 2 million guilders, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money, making him one of the richest people ever. He had built a fortune that spanned continents, influenced the election of emperors, and helped finance voyages to the New World. Some historians even believe he funded the expedition of Ferdinand Magellan, though records are inconclusive. After his death, his nephew Anton took over. The business continued for generations but never again reached the heights attained under Jakob. The market changed, competition intensified, and political turmoil eroded monopolies. Yet the Fugger survived. To this day, residents still pay a token rent and pray for the Fugger family. The rules remain largely unchanged. It stands as a physical reminder of the man who thought in centuries, not quarters. His power was subtle yet immense. He could whisper into the ear of a pope or king and watch policies shift. He understood that controlling credit meant controlling destiny. Empires rose and fell, but his interest accrued steadily. He was also a man of paradox. He championed capitalism yet imposed strict rules on his charity. He financed churches while undermining the very system of salvation they sold. He was generous and ruthless, pious and pragmatic. For those who see bankers as villains, he offers ammunition. For those who view finance as the lifeblood of progress, he is a hero. In truth, he was neither and both. He was a man shaped by his time and shaping it. His life teaches us that money, like water, seeks its level. It will flow along paths of least resistance, carving channels through mountains and feeding rivers that nourish or flood. Those who learn to direct its flow wield enormous influence. It also warns us that wealth comes with consequences. The sale of indulgences to repay loans triggered religious wars. The concentration of resources in a few hands bred resentment. The creation of credit chains bound communities together and exposed them to shocks. Jakob Fugger understood risk, but even he could not foresee all outcomes. His loans propped up empires and set them tumbling. His philanthropy saved lives and inspired envy. His ambition opened minds and also opened wounds across Europe. In the end, he did not rule as a king. He never sat on a throne or led an army, yet he wielded the power to decide who could afford armies and who could not, who could build cathedrals and who had to beg. He was a citizen of Augsburg, a subject of the Holy Roman Empire, but he forged a world that transcended borders. He spoke the universal language of accounts, and his words were written in gold and silver. He shows us that money can be a tool for good, funding art, housing, and exploration, or a weapon that tears at the social fabric. It is neither inherently noble nor evil. It magnifies the intentions of its steward. History shows that when wealth becomes too concentrated, it invites backlash. When bankers appear to control governments, people reach for torches. The Reformation and the 30 Years' War were not just theological, they were economic rebellions. Jakob Fugger never saw the devastation of the 30 Years' War. He died before the storm broke, but the seeds were sown in his time, in his partnerships with princes, in his financing of indulgences, and in his uncompromising pursuit of profit. We should not blame him alone for Europe's tragedies. He was part of a wider system. Yet his life reminds us that decisions made in boardrooms and counting houses can unleash forces far beyond their walls. When we picture him sitting at a table with a ruler, ledger open, quill poised, we can imagine the weight of his choices. Every stroke of ink could finance a cathedral or ignite a revolt. He wrote often that power is power, meaning that promises and titles mean little without resources to back them. Today, we might translate that as saying that budgets matter more than speeches. The Fugger's decline shows that fortunes can be fleeting. Competition, regulation, and changing tastes can erode even the mightiest monopolies. What endures are institutions like the Fugger and the lessons etched into history. Jakob Fugger was more powerful than kings, not because he could command armies, but because he could decide whether armies marched. He understood that credit is the oxygen of states. Cut it off and the mightiest empire suffocates. His life is a story of calculation and courage, of risk and reward, of faith and cynicism. It is a reminder that the pursuit of wealth can change the world in ways that even the richest banker cannot predict. When we walk through the quiet streets of the Fugger, past the simple houses with their tidy gardens, we are reminded that behind every great fortune is not just ambition, but also an obligation to society. Jakob Fugger's tale ends there, in the echo of prayers whispered by grateful tenants and the rustle of leaves in a courtyard built by a man who saw the future and tried to shape it with his gold.